Bjorn, thanks again for coming out and being able to do this with us.
Absolutely.
It was nice to be able to get you while you were out here on the West Coast.
Sure.
After the GSBF Convention, and appreciate the time for us to get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. Yeah,
as you kind of make the rounds around here. What kind of got you into bonsai originally when you were younger? I know you mentioned that you were pretty young on your podcast.
Sure.
And what kind of inspired you?
Yeah, so my initial introduction to bonsai was actually through the Karate Kid movies. Okay. I started karate at the age of 8, okay. And then when I was 12 years old, I saw the Karate Kid movies for the first time, and thought, oh, that looks kind of interesting. I'd always had kind of an interest in, Japanese culture, Japanese art, karate, all of that. So I thought, well, bonsai looks like an interesting thing to try out. So I asked for my first tree for my 13th birthday, and I got it from my folks. It was a little Japanese garden juniper from Home Depot. And I'm pretty sure it was dead when I got it. It had the rocks glued on the top. It had the little mud man underneath it, little Mr. Miyagi sitting underneath it. Right. And I put it on my nightstand for a couple of weeks, and it was completely brown at that point. So, yeah, that was my initial introduction was through the Karate Kid movies.
Okay. Sure. So how did you develop your skills early on when you just started at 13?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, back then there wasn't much information on the internet at all, so I found whatever books I could possibly find. I think the Sunset book was one of the first ones that I got. The RD Reader's Digest Home Handbook. Okay. I think Harry Tomlinson had written that one at that time. I think Peter Warren's done an updated version recently, but that was one of the first books that I got. And then there was no club in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I was from. So initially it was more just with the books, trying to suss out if there was somebody in the area that was also interested in bonsai. And then when I think I was maybe 14, I found a guy up in Pigeon Forge, which is about an hour outside of Knoxville, up near Gatlinburg, that area, who was teaching a bonsai class. It was just at a local nursery up there, but it was the only person I had heard of in the whole area that was doing that. So I took the class, went up there a couple of times to work with him. And then Warren Hill, who was the former curator of the National Bonsai Collection up in DC, he retired down to Tennessee, down to East Tennessee. So he was only about an hour from where we were in Knoxville, and I started going out to his place when I was, I think, probably 15. So those were he was really my first teacher.
So as you, start out, your bonsai career, I guess, if you will, at that early age, and your parents kind of saw you kind of get seriously interested in it, what did they say? What did they think, especially with, the hobby being more of, people who are a little bit older in age?
Sure, yeah. I think they weren't that concerned about, it being an older person's hobby at the time. There was nobody else doing it at the time, so I don't even think they had a clue that it was mostly older people that did it. They were mostly concerned that, I was using every ounce of my allowance money that I had to buy trees, and they were afraid that as I got, further along in high school and then went off to college, that I'd become more interested in girls than the trees, and right. All this money that I'd spent on the trees would be a waste because the trees would end up dying. But actually, as I got into university, I decided to study Japanese language with the intention, at least in the back of my head, of becoming a bonsai apprentice in Japan. I never told my folks that at the time because I didn't think that they would support that very much. So I did that kind of on the side, and then learned Japanese, and then as soon as I graduated, I went to Japan to start my apprenticeship. So initially, they had no idea that was my intention.
Sure. So now that you've gone on to college and studied a major that allowed you to go over to Japan, was that ultimate decision based on a pursuit of a apprenticeship?
Yeah, it wasn't, I think in the back of my head, it wasn't like an active thing, like, okay, I'm going to get an apprenticeship as soon as I finish university. It was more, I want to go to Japan at some point to work if possible. If I could do bonsai, that'd be awesome, but probably it's not likely to happen. But things sort of just kind of came into being through the course of my undergrad program. I had to spend my junior year of university in Japan to complete the language component of my degree. And during that period, I went down to visit Mr. Fujikawa, who eventually became my oyakata, my teacher, where I studied in Japan, and try to develop as much of a relationship with him at that point as I possibly could. And then I started writing him letters my senior year of university after I went back to the States, and then he accepted me to come over. I think I graduated the first week of May, and I was back in Japan the second week of May of 2008 to start my apprenticeship.
You met Mr. Fujikawa, through that. I guess family that kind of took you in during that program, that first time originally.
Yeah. So I should probably back up and talk a little bit about that, because the first time I went to Japan, I was 16. In my hometown in Knoxville, Tennessee, they used to have a Panasonic headquarters there. And every year they would give 4 high school students an opportunity to go to Japan on a 2-week cultural exchange program. So I went through the interview process, wrote the essay, and got chosen when I was 16 to go. So the host family that I was staying with in Osaka, I told them that my hobby was bonsai, and they got online and started searching for local nurseries in the area, and Fujikawa-san's nursery was one of those that came up. So they took me over to visit him. We spent a couple hours there one morning, and then he kind of jokingly said, you know, if you ever want to come back and be an apprentice, here's my business card. It was a total joke, but I took it kind of seriously and put it in my pocket, and kept that business card for 6 years, and then contacted him again my senior year of university to try to get that apprenticeship hooked up. So that was my first introduction to him. I was only 16 years old. Yeah.
You also mentioned in your podcast that you were the first apprentice of his. What made you want to learn under a master who hadn't had an apprentice before?
Sure, yeah. I think part of it was, the conversation that I'd had with him when I was 16 that really stuck with me, but the other part was I really liked the material, the trees that he had at his facility at Chikugo-En, which is the name of the nursery. I really, really liked the style of trees there, and I was actually debating on studying with him or studying at Saburo Kato's nursery up in Tokyo, in Omiya, the Omiya Bonsai Village. Well, I came to find out later that Fujikawa-san, my teacher, actually was an apprentice under Saburo Kato, so their aesthetic in terms of the trees was very similar, so I was drawn to both. One had influenced the other. So that was really one of the main reasons. And then the other reason was because during my junior year of university, I had a girlfriend in Japan, and that girlfriend ended up becoming my wife. So I wanted to be as close to her as possible, so Osaka is a lot closer to Kyoto where she was living than if I had moved up to Tokyo. That would have been too much of a long distance relationship, so that was another factor, if I'm being completely honest.
Absolutely. I mean, that's right up there with your career and potential relationships.
Sure. I think maybe if I hadn't met her my junior year, I don't know if I would have gone through with doing a bonsai apprenticeship, because she wasn't the one who kind of goaded me on to do the apprenticeship. She wanted me to come back to Japan, obviously, but knowing that I had a support system like her in Japan when I started the apprenticeship made it that much easier to kind of transition into that right after university.
Yeah, I know you generally talk about culture and language barriers for anyone here in the U.S. Going over there. What were some of your expectations as an early apprentice there? Do you think you're just going to work on amazing trees, or?
Sure, yeah. So I had talked to a few people who had done apprenticeships, guys from the West who had gone over, people from the States, people from Europe who had gone to do apprenticeships, and I got the general idea that, okay, the first year at least you're going to be sweeping, cleaning the toilet, pulling weeds, maybe unwiring trees if you're lucky, and that'll be about the amount of exposure you get to working on trees. But in my case, what I found when I got there was, because I was the only apprentice there, I was the first one, there was nobody else there, I got launched into doing more hands-on work with the trees than most of the other apprentices at other nurseries. So I was lucky in that regard. That being said, Fujikawa-san he was a hard ass back in those days. So he's calmed down over the years. He's softened his approach quite a bit. So I think our new apprentices have a little bit of a different experience maybe than I did. And my kohai, Mayoka-san, is a Japanese fellow. He came in about 2 years after I started. And he and I, we reminisce about the days of old at the nursery, and how tough it was at that point. Yeah.
When you go back and you get a chance to see the apprentices, when you give your tours and all that, could you give a little bit of that brotherly love back to those apprentices to help them know, what it was like?
Yeah, I think give them
a little hard time.
Yeah, you got to give them a little bit of a hard time, I guess, a little bit of a ragging, but the whole goal of coming into a nursery setting like that is to learn bonsai as much as possible. So when you come in as the top apprentice, the oyakata, the teacher, is supposed to sort of provide that knowledge to you, whether verbally or non-verbally, just by observation. That's their job to do that. But then you, as that top apprentice, your job is then to pass that on to your kohai, or the people below you, as they come into the nursery. And as the older apprentices move out and become professionals, then the people who were kohai before become senpai to the new kohai, and it just sort of repeats the process. So when I go back and see the new apprentices that are there right now, I try to give some advice, and not necessarily bonsai related advice. It's more, particularly if they're from overseas and they're studying in Japan, it's more like cultural advice, like how do you cope with certain situations, what to expect from Fujikawa-san, at these times of the year, or when he's in this kind of mood, how can you respond to that? So it's more stuff like that, more life advice than necessarily bonsai related advice. Yeah.
Got it. What was one of your more memorable times during your apprenticeship for the 6 years or so that you were an apprentice?
Yeah, it's hard to condense it down to one.
Was there one story that
I would say
stuck out?
One thing that sticks with me quite a bit. When you do an apprenticeship, you're typically offered a 3-month trial period to start with. Mm-hmm. So I started that trial period in May of 2008. So in about early July of that same year, I was still in that 3-month trial period, and Fujikawa and I were working on a medium-sized Itoigawa Shinpaku. It was a really spectacular tree. His goal was to prepare this tree, 4 or 5 years out to go into the Kokufu, the Japanese National Exhibition. So the tree's main feature was what's called a tenjin. It's an apical jin, so a piece of dead wood that sticks out of the top of the tree. So he wanted to compress the tree to make it as compact as possible so we could regrow it out. So he asked me to reach my hands in the tree and crush it together so he could put the guy wire on. I reached my hands and I started crushing. I heard this loud crack. And the tenjin at the top, it just slowly fell over. Oh. So what had happened was the tenjin was actually emanating from inside of the tree, and I had grabbed that instead of a solid point on the trunk, and I had snapped the whole feature of the tree off. So what he did after that, he took the tree, put it out in the most prominent place in the garden, and left it there for 2 years, just for me to sit and look at it every time I walked in the nursery. So he refused to sell it, he refused to work on it again, he just put it right there so everybody could walk in and see it, and I could see it on a daily basis. So never forgot that lesson. Yeah, always pay attention to what you're doing. So it was mostly because I was delirious from not having slept in a couple of months after or having arrived there. Because normally with an apprenticeship, it's 7 days a week, you might get 1 day off a month, but during that trial period, as an oyakata, as a teacher, he's pushing you as much as possible to see where your breaking point is, see if you can make it through that period, and then if everything works out, your personality gels with his and vice versa, then he'll take you on as a full-time apprentice. So I was delirious at that point, hadn't slept in weeks, so that was why I had a lapse in judgment working on that tree.
Would it be like 3 hours of sleep a night?
Yeah, it was a little more than that.
Okay.
It wasn't. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't ridiculous or anything. It's more of the marathon of going from university life where you can kind of goof off. You got a class on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You might have a night class 1 night a week, but the rest of the week you're kind of on your own. And then you have weekends off, where you go from that to 7 straight days a week. Then it may only be 8 o'clock until 6 o'clock, but 7 straight days a week.
Ultimate focus.
Yeah, ultimate focus. Like you get the new culture that you're trying to insert yourself into and learn as much as possible about, and then the language barrier. I'd done my undergraduate degree in Japanese language, but they only teach you reading and writing as part of that. So I had almost no speaking skills when I went to Japan to start the apprenticeship. So it was a struggle figuring that out as well. So all of those things compounded and came together at once. Yeah.
What would be the most memorable tree of the 9 years that you were there with him? Is there one or two that really stick out to you that you got a chance to work on? Yeah, there are a couple of trees. I'll give you an example of a conifer and a broadleaf tree. So of the conifers, there was a procumbens, and not like the procumbens nana garden junipers you see in the States. It was a collected juniperus procumbens. They call it sonade in Japanese. Just a spectacular tree. It's hard to describe, but came way up in the air. There was a single branch that had been brought back around naturally, and all of the foliage was attached to that one branch. This tiny lifeline was wrapped around and feeding this massive foliage on the tree. It was one of my favorite plants to work with. And then with the deciduous trees, Fujikawa-san's father, Minoru Fujikawa, he started the nursery in 1958. He focused on deciduous trees early on in his career. So he started the nursery as a flower shop, moved into Satsuki azaleas, and then in the late 60s, early 70s, moved into bonsai with a focus on deciduous trees. So some of the projects that he had started in the late 60s, we still have at the nursery. So the very famous Stewardia, Shishigashira Japanese maple, and a few others. So out of those, getting to work on those particular trees, particularly the Shishigashira that he had started from
from nothing, basically. You know, maybe a 50-cent piece size Nabari, and now it's like a 3-foot wide Nabari. Wow. With, you know, perfect branch structure. Probably one of the top 3 Shishigashiras in all of Japan. Mm-hmm. So to get to work on that and, you know, be part of that history, and, you know, that's one of those trees that'll always stay at the nursery, never get sold off. It's just kind of a legacy tree for the family. So to get to work on that was a lot of fun.
Is there anything that you miss about the apprentice life?
Yeah, I mean, I miss living in Japan a lot. It's nice to be back in the States, and, you know, we've started our nursery now, and, you know, it's a new chapter in our lives, my wife and I, but, you know, I miss a lot of the cultural aspects of Japan. I miss the lifestyle in Japan. I miss the schedule of an apprenticeship. Like, now I travel about 250 days out of the year. I'm always living out of a suitcase. You know, I liked being in Japan and being able to wake up and say, okay, I have to be at the nursery at 7:30. We're going to work until 9, 10 o'clock at night. But you get to work on the best trees in the world, and I just like that schedule. You know, I miss all of that. I miss the routine.
Switching gears a little bit, you know, to American bonsai. You know, how have you seen American bonsai evolved, maybe over the last 10 years or so, from, you know, the time where you started as apprentice to
Sure.
to where you are now and doing a lot of traveling?
Sure, yeah. So I think the biggest change I've seen is that, you know, the techniques that we use or we learn in Japan now are sort of based around what's called Gendai Bonsai, contemporary bonsai. And really, contemporary bonsai started in the early 1980s when they had the big economic bubble period. It kind of shifted, and a lot of people were spending more money on bonsai. So all of these nurseries were looking for ways to differentiate their products, and that kind of came in the form of, you know, more detail wiring, more attention to detail, focus on ramification, focus on quality. So from like the mid-70s to the mid-80s, the increase in quality in Japan was unbelievable. So now that a lot of us have gone to Japan over the last, I'd say, 15 years or so to do apprenticeships and are coming back to the States, we're now taking those techniques that were developed during that period that are still used in Japan now and applying them to native US material. So that's one of the biggest differences actually I see in parts of California, like Southern California in particular, versus Northern California and then the rest of the country as well. So, you know, Southern California, you kind of have some of the old guard kind of guys, you know, that are sort of the godfathers of bonsai in the States, you know, who started that here. A lot of the Japanese that settled here, you know, guys like John Naka, Harry Hirao, Ben Oki, people like that who started that here. That's more of a sort of a pre-contemporary approach to bonsai, when there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It just looks a little bit different than what we do in a modern context. So I see as you move further north in California, there's a bit more focus on the contemporary, and then as you move out further into the States, there's even more focus on that. So things seem to be shifting more in that direction. And I think it's really interesting because the techniques in Japan are being applied to native US material here. And in my opinion, in the mountains in the States, we have the best quality Yamadori in the world, coniferous material. I mean, better than anywhere, better than Japan, better than China, anywhere in the world. So the potential is there. It just needs to have the proper techniques applied to it. And that doesn't mean necessarily copying the way it's done in Japan, but at least taking the horticultural practices, the technical practices, applying it to the trees, and then seeing what cultural influences, you know, manifest themselves down the road with that material.
Are you seeing a higher rise in popularity, especially the use of that native species here in the U.S. As you're, you know, traveling around, you know, going to various clubs or various shows or various conventions?
Yeah. Everybody wants native Yamadori right now in the States. So the thing that I've seen the most increase in popularity in is probably Rocky Mountain junipers. Not so much down here, you know, it's quite hot here. I don't know how well that species does down here. I do know a few people that have kept a few down here, but in the rest of the States, that's the #1, you know, most popular species. The trunks are just incredible. The foliage leaves a little bit to be desired, but we're figuring out techniques to make that work, or grafting, you know, changing the foliage type to make it more practical and usable. But that's probably been the species that I've seen increase in popularity the most. But beyond that, I mean, just Yamadori in general, everybody is you know, craving it. They want it. They want more and more and more. So you're seeing really good guys going out in the mountains now all over the States and collecting, you know, and doing it in a very ethical way, which is also a good thing to see. You know, they're not just going out and pillaging the mountainside, and whatever doesn't survive, they just throw on the ground. They're actually trying very hard to be discerning about what they collect, which is good.
You hear from, you know, a lot of different people who go over to Japan, hearing that, you know, a lot of young people aren't as interested in bonsai in Japan as it used to be before. You're a fairly young guy yourself. How do you think or what are some ways that you think, you know, younger people could be interested in bonsai here in America?
In the States, I think there are a lot more young people interested in it now than there were even just 5, 6, 7 years ago. Every club I go to, there's always a handful of young people, and every time I go back to those clubs, there's even more young people getting into it. And that's mostly, I think, due to social media. You know, spreading it around as YouTube channels, Facebook, Instagram. You're seeing trees everywhere. So the popularity is growing because of that. I think in the Japanese context, you know, the economy's kind of been stagnant since the early 90s over there, and really since that period you've seen kind of a decline in younger people going into it, particularly as a profession. But that's only because there's not much of an economic opportunity in it, because the economy is poor, there's not a lot of disposable income in the general population, so they're not investing that in things like bonsai anymore. So a lot of young people don't see it as a viable career option. Whereas here in the States, the economy is, I mean, despite the fact we had the recession 10 years ago, the economy is actually quite good. You know, so there's that factor, there's a social media, and then there's this new understanding that we have such good yamadori in the mountains, so the popularity is increasing like crazy even among younger people. Plus millennials tend to spend more money than they actually have. So, you know, which is probably not a good thing necessarily for their economic situation, but it definitely helps the professionals who are starting nurseries, and it helps the hobby in general too. You know, It really gets people focused on investing in higher quality material, which gets the collectors out collecting better material. So you get this kind of exponential increase in quality very quickly.
With that increase and with the increase in popularity and some younger people, you know, where do you see yourself, you know, how impacting, you know, bonsai here in America? What, you know, with all the YouTube followers now that you have, or social media that you do, and gaining that popularity here in the U.S., you know, what do you think, you know, how do you want to, you know, personify, you know, what you're doing now that you're back here in the States?
Sure, yeah. I think up until recently, a majority of the people who have studied in Japan, done apprenticeships, come back to the States, they've ended up on the west coast for the most part. Portland's a big area, obviously, you know, all over California as well. Whereas the East Coast has been kind of behind, and really we've been behind in general on the East Coast. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, you have the Japanese population that settled in California. Some of the best trees in the country are in California, and that's been the case forever. So one reason why I wanted to settle on the eastern half of the U.S. is to, you know, sort of cater to that market that's over there, because there's so many people who are really interested in bonsai on that half of the states. And really we have 70% of the population of the United States lives east of the Mississippi. I mean, that's a huge chunk of the country is over there. So we want to be able to provide quality material, quality education above all else to that side of the country, and start bringing in material from the West Coast, from the western half of the U.S. to the eastern side, so people have a source of that. And that's not to say there isn't anybody over there that's done a good job of that. You've got guys like Jim Doyle up at Nature's Way, who's done a really great job of moving yamadori up to that part of the country. You've got Bill Valvanis up in Rochester, he's had a major focus on deciduous material. So there's guys like that have done a great job of that. But in the Southeast in particular, we're based in Nashville, there's nobody really down in that area. So we're hoping to kind of help raise the level in that part of the states, and then all over the East Coast.
As a young, you know, bonsai beginner, let's say, you know, like myself, what are some tips that you would give to someone who's trying to get interested in it? Would you say try to find a club, try to find a teacher? And what would be some of those things that you would have people, you know, really look and seek out? Sure. Or is it just books?
No, I would say, well, right now there seems to be a big shift away from books, physical books, to sort of online outlets. Like I have an online beginner, intermediate, and advanced course that I did with Bonsai Empire, and that's geared towards kind of a bit of a younger crowd, people who are more tech savvy, where, you know, you create a username and a password, and you pay the subscription fee, and then you can watch these videos, but they guide you through the process of creation, of horticulture, of what you should do to this species at this time of year versus this time of year. So that's, I think, a good thing to get into. And then really you should join a club in your local area, so that you have people who are there helping you with the hands-on aspect of it. Because you can watch a video just like you can read a book all day long, but unless you actually get the hands-on experience and have somebody kind of watching over your shoulder and giving you, you know, advice as to, you know, each situation that you run into with a particular tree, you're not really going to grow as quickly as you could. So I think, you know, getting into a club is a great thing to do. And then there are a lot of study groups that are popping up all over the states that are usually the study groups are the core group from the club. Say, you know, the people who are really gung-ho within that club, they kind of break away and have their additional study group. So if you can get into something like that, you know, and those groups are always willing to take new people in, people that are gung-ho. So if you can find those folks within a club that you can join up with, and they meet probably, you know, at least once, twice a month, that would be a really good thing to do as well.
With the opening of Eisei-En, how did it go? Did it go according to plan? Was it a little bit crazy for that opening? And
yeah, it was way beyond my expectations. So we didn't really do much promotion for it. I kind of wanted it to be sort of a soft opening, because, you know, we started building the nursery really in June of this year. It was very, very short amount of time. I'd had these guys on contract since last November to grade the land, but it rained every other day from last November until June of this year. Oh. So the dirt was like soup. They couldn't do anything on the property. And finally it dried up in June. We got them out there. They started the process. We built the fence, built the benches, put it all together, had all the trees there. I drove cross country a couple of times bringing material over from the West Coast. So, you know, it was all set up and ready to go, but I don't have a staff yet. It's just my wife and myself. You know, we didn't want to have 8 million people come in for it, so we did very little promotion for it. But even with that, we still had about 300 people for the weekend come through. So it was way beyond. It was twice what I expected to show up. So it went very, very well. And then we had Naoki Mayoka from Japan, who did a demonstration. We had Mar Stenberger from Italy, and they both did a fantastic job. So I think they really brought in a lot of people as well. They're very well known around the world, and that was the first time. I think that's the first time that Maro has been to Nashville. I know that's the first time Mayoka-san's been there. So they drew a lot of people in from that as well. So it went much better than expected. So,
when did you first envision Eisei-En? And was it kind of what you had envisioned as well?
Yeah, so, you know, during the course of my apprenticeship, and I think it's true for everybody who doesn't have a family nursery to go back to, you're always thinking, okay, where should I set up? How should I build it? What's the infrastructure going to be like? You know, how do I go about funding that and getting to that point? So it's been interesting, because all of the little details that I wanted to have happen in the nursery have happened, but all of the big picture things have actually been very different. Usually it's kind of a backwards thing. You know, you usually get the big picture things and all the details kind of change. Like, I wanted the benches to be a certain way. We were able to do that. The fence looks completely different than what I wanted. The layout of the garden looks completely different than what I had envisioned in my head, but I like the way that it turned out. So you kind of, when you have a piece of land, particularly like where we are, where it's all covered in limestone, you have to kind of, you know, you have to mold the land to, you know, whatever it gives you. So it didn't come out exactly the way I had envisioned, but I actually like it, I think, better than what I had in my head to start with.
So what opportunities does Eisei-En provide to, you know, the greater public?
Sure, yeah. So we just started our intensive bonsai courses, or we're getting ready to start them. We put out the promotion for them earlier this year, and they've all filled up. But what those involve is we have it set up in a a dual track setup. So you can either take the conifer track or you can take the broadleaf track. The conifer track, it covers everything conifer related, so pines, junipers, cypress, spruce, everything. And you come 3 times per year for 3 days each time over the course of 3 years. It's the same thing for the broadleaf track, but the focus is on broadleaf evergreens and deciduous trees. So everything from olives to gardenias to maples to hornbeams, all of that gets covered in that track. So we have right now 3 groups of conifer folks and 2 groups of broadleaf. And then next year we'll start a new round. Right now we're totally full for next year, but later next year we'll start a new round of those classes. So we're doing that. We're doing more online tutorials as well. I've got an advanced course. A second half of my advanced course is coming out with Bonsai Empire next spring, so we're filming that right now. And then we're also going to be doing one-off workshops throughout the year, so, you know, like a bring your own tree kind of deal at the nursery, or a repotting workshop, or hinoki workshop, species specific workshops, things like that. So we're trying to provide as much of an educational outlet as possible, and then through that process we're also designing and making material too, so that the general public has access to high quality stuff, if not to purchase it, at least to see it as an educational tool to understand, you know, what high quality bonsai is supposed to be.
So is some of your long-term goals with Eisei-En is to travel a little bit less than 250 days a year?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting next year, I've knocked that down to about half, I would say. which is still a lot, but it's not nearly as much as what I'm doing at this point. And then from 2020 onward, my goal is to only be out of the nursery for about 2.5, 3 weeks the entire year. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that happens. But that's the goal. That's why we built, one reason why we built Eisei-En to begin with, is so that people come to us or come to me rather than me going to them, but also so I can create quality material that we can develop long term, so that people can really understand, you know, what quality is, and that we can use our material here to make stuff that's just as good, if not better, than what you see in Japan.
So where can we learn more information about Eisei-En?
Sure, yeah. So the best thing to do would be to go to our website. It's eisei-en.com, eisei-en.com, or you can search for us on Facebook or Instagram. Those would be the 3 things that we update the most. So check that out if you're interested in following us or seeing what's going on at the nursery.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the
Absolutely.
time.
Yeah, thank you.
And we hope to see you soon.
Sounds good, man. Thank you very much.
So what's your favorite word?
Favorite word in what language?
Any language.
Any
Japanese or English?
Any language. I don't know. I actually like the word thank you in Japanese. I had an Irish friend when I was in university in Japan for my junior year, and he would always mispronounce the word. It's doi tashimashite, but he would always say doi tashimashitashi. So every time I hear doi tashimashite, I always laugh. So that's probably my favorite word in Japanese.
When we were kids, we would call it "Don't touch my mustache."
Oh yeah, there you go. That's perfect.
What's your least favorite word?
Least favorite word. In Japanese, so there's different ways to say to eat. So you can say taberu, or meishiagarimasu is a very honorific way to say it. But there's another word, ku. I hate that word. It's like, a lot of people hate the word moist in English. Like, that's my moist in Japanese. I hate that word. Oh, I hate it so much.
What turns on your creativity, spirituality, you know, emotionally?
What thing turns you on?
Oh.
What thing turns me on? Getting really drunk. Right before I work on trees. No. No, we do that at the end of the day. No. I don't know. Getting up really early in the morning and going out into our garden, into Eisei-En. You know, we have 10 acres there. But it's only about 6,000 square feet that we built as the garden, the initial garden. But we've got big trees all around the property, and the sunlight, as it's coming up, it goes through the trees, and you can see it kind of coming into the garden. That's like the coolest feeling in the world. I go out with a cup of coffee and walk around for 10-15 minutes while the sun is coming up. That's the best part of the day for me. That gets me inspired for the rest of the day.
What's one of your biggest turn-offs?
Turn-offs. Good question.
Most people say car horns and car alarms. Babies crying.
Yeah. Biggest turn-off, man. That's a good question. I don't know. I never really. You talking about in terms of working on trees or
anything?
In terms of anything.
Anything?
Yeah, these are just whatever you think, whatever you want to talk about.
A branch improperly placed?
Yeah. So probably the biggest turn-off for me is the people with egos. It drives me nuts. Like, I look at bonsai as, you know, it's a career choice, and it's you know, it's an art, and it's my livelihood. But at the same time, I mean, we're just playing with little trees. Like, don't take it so seriously. You're just having fun. Enjoy it. You get into it because it's fun to start with, because you like it. It's a hobby. You know, it brings joy to your life. Don't be a jackass about it. You know, particularly if you do it as a career, you get more popular, well known. There's no reason to be like that. You're not saving the world. You're playing with little trees.
What sound or noise do you love?
Sound or noise do I love? Actually, when we were living in Japan, and even in the South too, in the States, in August we have the cicadas. Most people hate them. I actually really like them. I don't know, it drowns out the sound of everything else. It's like white noise. You don't hear people, you know, screaming down the road or anything. It just keeps everything even keel. So I always like the cicadas in the summer.
What sound or noise do you not like?
It's probably stereotypical, but like nails on a chalkboard. Ugh, yeah, I hate that, yeah.
What profession, other than your own, would you like to attempt?
Oh, I wanted to be a rock star for a long time. I used to play guitar in a rock band back in like late high school through college, and we were the dorkiest dudes in the world. Everybody in the band was like a valedictorian, or top of the class, or like I was lead trombone in the marching band. So we were all a bunch of nerds. We wanted to make this band so we could get girls. We never got a single girl to go out with us from the band, and the main reason is because all of our parents would come to every single show that we played, all throughout college, the whole time. Even if it was like 4-hour drive away, they'd come to the show. So we never got a single girl off of that.
Any videos on YouTube of that you want to share?
There are, but they're not on my channel. You'll have to suss them out yourself. So I'm not going to tell you what the name of the band was, so you can look it up. Yeah.
What profession do you not like to do?
I couldn't see myself sitting in an office kind of crunching numbers. I need to be outside. I gotta be working with plants. That's just, I have to be doing that. So I did a quality control job for a short period of time for a Japanese auto parts company, and it was just mind-numbing. I couldn't stand. I couldn't imagine going back to that. I have to be outdoors. So really anything indoors. I need to be outside.
Okay. And if heaven existed, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Huh. That is a very odd question. I don't know. I really don't know. What do people normally say?
Come on in, have a beer.
Am I in or am I out?
That's a good question.
Think about it. You can put it in one of your vlogs.
Yeah, I'll do that. I like that. Let's do that. All right.
Thanks, man.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Awesome.
really very much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so
problem.
much.
That was a cool interview. I look forward to seeing this.